men quivered with weary suffering when in the open air, and even under the grass huts or improvised tents the temperature always registered 115 degrees during the hottest hours of the day. The nights were, however, cool and pleasant. But although the main part of the force found the days long and tedious, the time which the army spent at Ras el Hudi was by no means uneventful. The work of the squadrons was hard, and ceased only with the night. The continual patrolling told severely on men and horses, and the fact that the Dervishes were far stronger in the mounted arm than the Sirdar's army necessitated the utmost vigilance of the cavalry commander. Employment was also found for the gunboats. When Mahmud had left the Nile he had established a sort of depot at Shendi, in which the wives of the Emirs and the surplus stores had been deposited. This treasure house was protected only by a slender garrison of 700 riflemen and 25 horsemen. On ordinary military grounds, and also since the event might infuriate the Arabs, it was decided to capture this place and disperse its defenders. Accordingly, on the afternoon of the 24th, the 3rd Egyptian Battalion from Lewis's brigade marched from Ras el Hudi to Atbara Fort and relieved the 15th Egyptians then in garrison, and a small force under Commander Keppel, consisting of the 15th Egyptians under Major Hickman, 2 field guns of Peake's battery, and 150 Jaalin irregulars, was embarked on, or in boats towed by, the 3 gunboats Zafir, Nasser, and Fateh, and started the same night for Shendi. At dawn on the 27th the flotilla appeared off Shendi. The Dervishes had been apprised of its approach and prepared to offer resistance, but the force against them was overwhelming. Under cover of the gunboats the infantry and guns were landed. The artillery then came into action, but after they had discharged 2 shells, the Arabs fled, firing their rifles with little effect. Shendi was occupied by the Egyptians. The pursuit was left to the Jaalin, and in it they are said to have killed 160 men, a revenge which must have been doubly sweet, since it was consummated so near to the scene of the destruction of their tribe, and was also attended by scarcely any danger. Loot of all kinds fell to the victors, and the gunboats were soon laden with a miscellaneous spoil. The wives of the important Emirs made their escape to Omdurman, but upwards of 650 women and children of inferior rank were taken prisoners and transported to the Atbara, where in due course they contracted new family ties with the Sudanese soldiery, and, as far as can be ascertained, lived happily ever afterwards. There were no casualties among the troops, but the Jaalin lost a few men in their pursuit. The force then returned to the Atbara. The 3rd of April was the last day the army spent at Ras el Hudi. The period of waiting was over. The enemy's position had been duly reconnoitred. His strength was believed to be sufficiently impaired for a successful attack to be made. The camp at Hudi was becoming very insanitary. Moreover, the situation, satisfactory though it was not one which the commander could view without anxiety. All the time that the army was operating on the Atbara, it drew its supplies from the fort at the confluence. Between this and the camp, convoys, protected only by a handful of Camel Corps, passed once in every 4 days. Only the idiotic apathy of the Dervishes allowed the communications to remain uninterrupted. Mahmud was strong in cavalry. It will be evident to anyone who looks at the map how easily a force might have moved along the left bank to attack the convoys. Such tactics would have occurred to most savage tribes, but in their last campaigns the Dervishes thought only of battles and disregarded all smaller enterprises. Had they assailed the communications, the Sirdar might have been forced to build a chain of forts and to guard his convoys with strong infantry escorts. The fighting force would have been weakened, the troops would have been wearied, and the result must have been delayed. The Dervishes had as yet attempted nothing, but there was no reason why they should not at any moment become enterprising. It was time to make an end. On the 4th of April the whole force moved to Abadar, and established themselves in a new camp 5 miles nearer the enemy. The tiger was tired of watching. He had taken his first stride towards his prey. Although the information as to the enemy's strength and position was accurate and complete, the Sirdar decided to order a final reconnaissance on the 5th of April. Starting at 4 o'clock, Broadwood cut off the sharp angle which the Atbara forms at Dabia, and, avoiding the thick bush, soon approached the Dervish camp. Not a sign of the enemy was seen during the march. The bush by the Atbara appeared deserted. The camp gave no sign of life. An ominous silence prevailed. The squadrons moved forward at a walk, keeping about 1,200 yards away from the enemy's zeriba and almost parallel to it. Presently, as they did so, a large force of cavalry became visible in front. It was difficult to estimate their strength, but they appeared to be superior in numbers to the reconnaissance. The Dervish horsemen continued to retire towards the southeast, always reaching round the Egyptian left flank. And while the Egyptian force advanced, as soon as they were opposite the southern end of the zeriba, another considerable body of Dervish horse issued from the northern side and threatened the line of retreat. At the same time the camp began to swarm with men, and crowds of tiny figures were observed clambering onto the entrenchments and gun emplacements, eagerly watching the development of the fight. The cavalry had by this time approached to within 1,000 yards of the zeriba, and the Arab artillery began to fire occasional round shot and clumsily fused shells. At 9 o'clock, the enemy's position having been again sketched and the approaches reconnoitred, Colonel Broadwood ordered the retirement to begin. The Maxims and artillery were in the centre, supported by Colonel Broadwood and 3 squadrons. Captain Baring with 3 squadrons watched the left flank, now in retirement, become the right. Captains Le Gallais and Perce guarded the river flank. The cavalry retired by alternate wings in measured fashion. But the enemy pressed on impetuously, and their horsemen, soon completely enveloping the desert flank of the Egyptians, began to threaten a charge. To meet this, Colonel Broadwood sent one of his squadrons from the centre to join those under Captain Baring, so that at about 9:45 the reconnoitring force was formed with 4 squadrons toward the desert, 2 with the guns, and 2 towards the river. The weakness of the river flank of the troops encouraged the Dervish horse lurking in the scrub to make a bold attempt to capture the guns. The movement was shrewd and daring, but the cavalry commander met it with admirable skill. The springing up of dust clouds hardly 300 yards away was his only warning. He immediately took command of the 2 squadrons under Perce and Le Gallais, and ordered them to right about wheel and charge. Thus headed by Broadwood himself, and with their British officers several horse lengths in front, the Egyptians broke into a gallop and encountered the Baggara line, which numbered not fewer than 400 men, but was in loose order, with firmness. They struck them obliquely and perhaps 1/3 of the way down their line, and breaking through, routed them utterly. While this dashing operation was carried out on the river flank, the Dervish cavalry, following up the retirement, also delivered an attack towards the guns. Thereupon Captain Baring with 2 squadrons galloped from the desert flank across the front of the artillery, and, riding through the advancing enemy, repulsed them with loss. The charge was good and effective, but the shock and confusion broke both squadrons, and although successful, they came through the Dervishes and back on to the river flank in some disorder. Perce and Le Gallais, who had just rallied, at once dismounted their men and opened carbine fire on the retreating Dervishes. Their action not only checked the enemy, but prevented, by getting the troopers off their horses, any chance of their being involved in the disorder of the squadrons who had just charged. Although their horsemen were thus sharply checked, the Dervish infantry continued, in spite of losses, to advance rapidly, and for a few minutes a hot musketry fire was exchanged by the Arab riflemen and the 2 dismounted squadrons. Captain Perce was severely wounded, and several other casualties occurred. But the whole force was drawing away from the enemy, and by 11 o'clock it had passed through the gap to the northeast and had shaken off all pursuit. The casualties in the operation were fortunately small. 1 British officer was wounded, 6 Egyptian troopers were killed and 10 wounded, and about 30 horses were lost or disabled. The details of the enemy's defences were now known. His strength was estimated from trustworthy information. It was evident from the